All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Ali Oromchian, the CEO and co-founder of HR for Health. And I want to thank you for taking time out of your day to join us for this really important conversation on HR and practice acquisitions. Whether you're acquiring your first practice, no matter what kind of healthcare practice it is, or if you're expanding your group, today's seminar is really designed to give you some HR insights and often overlooked talking points that can make or break your deal. And I'm excited to be doing this today and partnering with Perrin DesPortes, which I think I butchered, even though we just talked about it. For those of you that speak French, by the way, right? It's Deportes, but he's from South Carolina, so Perrin, welcome, and I'm excited to talk to you about your latest venture as well. But thanks for being here.
Hey, Ali, I've been looking forward to this for a while. I really appreciate you having me on, and we'll get this thing out of the ditch before too much longer. Don't worry
Yeah,
about a thing.
yeah.
This isn't going to be like foreign language lessons between the two of us. I assure you that.
Yeah, yeah, that's right, that's right. Although I just like to say déporté, it's like the only time I get to use my French, so so
Well,
it works
wait till I start working on your last name, my friend. All right,
out.
it's going to be problematic for the audience.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. Well, believe you me, I've had it butchered in so many different ways. It's ridiculous. So, um, but I want to definitely talk a little bit about next level executive, your latest venture. I mean, you are a super savvy businessman. You've done so many different things on the transition sides, and you've grown. You've been a partner. You've grown your own firm. Now you're doing next level, which I think, just to kind of set the stage, and please, tell the audience a little bit more about it. But to me, it's an organization that you created to really dedicate yourself to helping business owners, no matter, what, they are, whether they're dental or medical, to elevate their not just their leadership, but also streamlining operations and then making really strategic decisions as they plan to grow, which is an area that truly not everyone is trained in at all, before they start, growing their enterprises.
Yeah, that's right. I'll give you the quick elevator pitch on it, so to speak. I spent 15 years working for Patterson, running three different operations for them, and I learned a lot about executive leadership at a high level, at a corporate level, and growing up in that organization, I always had somebody to kind of model myself after, for lack of a better term. You could see how bigger businesses operated and how the executives operated the company and everything like that, and being in a corporate hierarchy certainly has its disadvantages. We can talk about that on a subsequent webinar, but it has its advantages from a leadership development perspective. The last 8 years, I've been a co-founder in two successful startups, Tusk Partners and Polaris Healthcare Partners, and we worked in each business. We worked really closely with the entrepreneurs who wanted to build group practices and ultimately exit group practices. But what I found was that somebody needed to have 5 locations, for example, before they could really afford and apply our services in either one of those companies, or they needed to have an established business and want to exit it. But what happens for the person who's got a successful practice, who has great clinical skills and a solid operation? Like, what's next, right?
Hmm.
They're at the top of their food chain from a leadership standpoint, and they don't know that building a group's the right thing for them, yes or no. And they've already worked with a dental practice management consultant, kind of outgrown that application, but they don't need a strategic growth consultant yet. And that's what next level is. It really serves that practice owner that has practice mastery, or somebody that's at 2 or 3 locations and is really looking to become a more effective executive of the business they own and operate, not just a clinician with a practice. So hopefully
Yeah.
that's a good enough synopsis there.
No, that's a great synopsis, and you're filling a gap, Perrin. You're filling a gap that I think is so needed right now, because to your point, I think people have spent the last 10 years seeing a lot of groups, with actually your help when you were at Tusk and at Polaris, grow and then sell to a larger group and become financially independent as a result. Now, that hasn't necessarily been the case for too many people the last 3 years, right? Revenues at the top DSO law firms, that represent, buyers has declined. DSO and MSO CPA firms that only really targeted them have their revenues have declined because these deals have shrunk is the reality. And now what we are seeing is a group of dentists and medical professionals, whether they're physicians or optometrists or med spas, they're all sort of out there wanting to do a deal, but they don't know how to get to that next level. And if you're here listening to us today, what we're going to bring is we're going to bring the legal, the operational, and a really people first lens into how to do a successful acquisition and then be able to grow into a organization that can transition at some point in the future. And Perrin, I mean, you and I think we've been part of, collectively probably thousands of transactions and over hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars worth of deals. And yet again, we see HR being overlooked a lot. And I don't mean just HR, but HR and the people side of things, right?
That's right. Yeah, I like to tell people that, again, coming from a corporate perspective, I understand the strategic nature of an accomplished HR department and the role that they play. And it's not just from a compliance standpoint; it really is from a strategy standpoint. And I've also learned, being an entrepreneur and having worked with a number of emerging groups in their growth path, that poor integration from a culture fit and an HR perspective erodes value faster than almost anything else in an acquisition. And if
Yeah.
you think you're just going to go off and buy another practice and it's no big deal, you can be an absentee owner and whatever happens over there happens, and change management is not something that's really worth your time, you're doing it wrong from day one.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So everyone, as you can see from the screen, we're going to go through all these topics in the next, 40 minutes or so. There's a lot to cover. So I'm going to just start by just setting the stage with the first couple of slides and then let Perrin kind of jump in. But here's what, here's the way we look at it, both at our law firm and also at HR for Health. What we are seeing in the marketplace is that in most healthcare transactions right now, buyers are focusing really heavily on what I call the headline numbers, right? Revenue, EBITDA, right? Patient count, production per provider. Those are absolutely crucial numbers. There's no doubt about that, but they don't tell the whole story, right? What we often get pushed to the side is the human element, as Perrin was just saying, and the people, right? The people are kind of ignored, or it's sort of, they just kind of come with the transaction. And ignoring them is where the problems start, because it's the team that's delivering the care. It's the team that's keeping the patients happy and runs the business every day. It's rarely, the doctor owners or the operational people. So here's the issue. HR risks don't show up on the balance sheet. We know that. They're buried in employment files, payroll practices, cultural misalignments. But when they surface post acquisition, they can lead to lawsuits, turnover, patient attrition, unnecessary costs. And so I guess in short, what we can say is that HR doesn't just support the business, it is the business, right? It is the business. And overlooking it during due diligence can turn a promising deal into a really costly mistake. And what's funny, Perrin, about this is, we hear a lot of the banks, the healthcare banks, say that less than 1% of their transactions across healthcare fails, right? And they are like, we have almost no failures in our loan portfolio, which is amazing. But I turn around and I always say that number is accurate, but a lot more people suffer, right? 1% might fail, but a huge number suffer. And what we're going to do today is make sure that they avoid suffering.
Yeah. Banks like to use the word failure, but you and I talk about underperformance. There's a
That's
difference.
right. That's right. That's right. That's right. So let me go through the quick couple pitfalls, and then I'll hand it to you to kind of go through some of your material. So pitfall number one that I see frequently is incomplete pay employee records, missing agreements, and then some compliance gaps, right? So as we kind of dive into it, is many practices, especially smaller practices or ones that are kind of family run and they're kind of growing quickly, paperwork is an afterthought. And during diligence, what we've seen is there's missing job descriptions, missing side wage notices. We're seeing I-9s are not updated. There's no employment agreements with the associates, or worse off, the associates are hired as independent contractors. And because a lot of these agreements are the legal defense that people need and buyers need, if there's ever a wage and hour claim or a discrimination claim or anything along those lines, they don't have the documentation to prove it. And this trend typically continues for many years until you have an acquirer. And Perrin, I know you know this better than most. You have someone who's coming in to buy the practices and they go, wait a second, you only hire independent contractors? What? You don't have an employment manual? You don't have any of these things? Have you ever seen that be a problem, Perrin?
Oh no, of course not. Not familiar with it in the least. Do you mean this person's been part of your practice for the last 10 years? You set their schedule, you furnish all the stuff they have to operate with and the team that backs them up, and they're a 1099. Yeah, okay. Tell me how that works.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And I know later on you're going to talk about how this impacts valuations, but I want everyone who's listening today to just keep this in mind. This isn't just about just a compliance issue. Obviously, my role as your lawyer is to make sure you don't get sued. Perrin's role, right, as your coach, your consultant, your buyer's advocate, your seller's advocate, he's had all these roles, is to help you maximize the value of your practice. And a lot of that comes down to these things. So, all right, so the second pitfall is misaligned compensation and benefits, right? So imagine you're buying a practice where the front staff earns, let's say, $18 an hour, and they get some benefits like 100% health insurance, which is rare, but let's just say that for this example. You merge the team with your team where the front desk person makes $22 an hour and you cover 50% of their premium. What happens next? Right? Everyone's happy? No, of course not. There's resentment and low morale and what they call quiet quitting. This is what happens, and this integration is a super important part of it. So some of the red flags are, making sure you're looking at the bonus structures and making sure they're compliant. Super generous vacation rollover policies, employee contributions to retirement plans. Like these are hugely important. And one of the things that we do at HR for Health is we have an entire diligence package that we help, sellers with and buyers with, that they can go through as they go down the road of either buying a practice or preparing their practice for sale, because our compensation and benefits audit makes sure that you're compliant, right? Make sure that you're compliant. So that's super important. And then the final thing that I'll say is the onboarding and cultural integration strategies, making sure everyone has the documents, that you're not just expecting the employees to fall in line, as they say. If you have new systems, you have new expectations, new leadership, this can be super threatening to these employees. And so make sure that you have a plan where they feel loved and they feel cared for and listened to. Because if they don't know who they report to, they don't know how to get their PTO requests and whatnot, that can be super, super discouraging. And of course, if they're on HR for Health, they'll have all that stuff at their fingertips, but they still need a welcome orientation and all those things. So super important there. So Perrin, tell us about the financial side. We know how to reduce risk. Tell us about that now.
Yeah, I think ultimately acquisitions come down to, and I think I've got this on a slide coming up at some point, come down to some type of combination of cash flow and risk. Now, in a
Mhm.
healthcare services type business, the people influence each of those directly. right? So when we start talking about acquiring a business and have an established team or a long tenured team, you know, the fact of the matter is, if they've been around for a long time, then we know two things. They're at the top end of the food chain in terms of salaries or wages, and they don't like change.
Right.
So you don't want to get off on the wrong foot with what should be your biggest asset or what should be your best way of maintaining the goodwill that you spent the time to purchase. So, you know, when we start transitioning into actually acquiring practices, here are a couple of just, a few points, some food for thought and things to consider. I find that people in the world of dentistry get excited about acquiring another practice, and they think that when a practice comes on the market for sale, they should buy it. All right. And I would tell you that not every practice is the same. And one of the fundamental mistakes is when people rush into making an acquisition and they don't do their due diligence and they just buy it because it's for sale, they inherit not only a lot of messes, but
Yeah.
also a lot of things that are almost irreconcilable, right? That they can't be integrated. If yours is a high end fee for service practice, for example, with maybe a little bit of insurance, and you go off and buy a predominantly insurance driven business with a Medicaid component to it, those are not the same businesses, even though they both may be categorized as general dentistry practices. So it's really important to understand the pitches not to swing at. If you ask these people that run the business development offices of major DSOs, they'll tell you that they really only swing it between 10 and 20 of the 10 and 20% of the pitches that they actually see. They say no to a lot more than they say yeah or maybe to. And that's an important discipline to be in. You know, when we talk about success and failure coming down to cash flow and risk, you kind of size it up like, how confident are you that you can either maintain or grow the consistency in cash flows coming out of the business after you acquire it? And what are the key risk variables? We went through a handful in your prior slide from an HR perspective, but there are a lot more risk variables that you need to be eyes wide open about. Some of them you're just going to have to say, I'm willing to take that risk. And others are going to be of a risk quotient where you say it's not worth it for me to take a cut at that. I'm gonna pass. Have the discipline to be what we call a slow yes and a fast no when it comes to an acquisition perspective.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. A slow yes, but a fast no. And Perrin, can you give us some insight? Like in the last 3 years, what have you seen change in the mindset of buyers? Because we've had a lot of our clients who are three, four, five, six offices come to you and ask you for help. And sometimes you've given them the hard truth, which is, look, you're not ready to be sold, right? You're chasing the EBITDA and you have maybe five, six, seven offices, but you're not ready to take that next step. And so can you tell us a little bit about that psychology of the buyer and that you've seen, at least the bigger buyers, and how that's impacted the sellers right now?
Yeah, I think it's a good question, and really one that we could go really deep on. So I'll try to be as succinct as I can. I think, a lot of the enterprise level buyers, private equity backed ventures for the most part, we're looking. A significant number of them were looking to simply aggregate dots on a map coming out of
Hmm.
COVID because lending rates were low, credit boxes were prolific, and it was just assembling dots on a map. They didn't really have an operator perspective or an integration play in mind. When you have rates escalating as fast as they have, and most of these private equity backed ventures are borrowing money, something to akin to like an interest only loan, like you and I would buy a house with,
Right.
an escalation in rates is intensely problematic from a free cash flow standpoint. And I think if you look at 3 years ago, it's let me buy dots on a map, money's cheap. If you look at it where it is today, it is a highly disciplined approach to acquiring a business from a seller who is willing to partner, to be a partner in the growth of that business. And the partner, the seller, is looking for a capital partner that will help them unlock further growth that they can't achieve through bank funding. So now that the fit, the philosophical fit, and the congruency between the mothership and the business being acquired is mission critical. When you go back down into the 1 to 5 location group size, emerging group space, they don't have the prolific available capital that an enterprise level DSO does. They're shooting with a rifle, not a shotgun. They've got to make sure the bullet lands on a target that they identify is worth it for them and their team to spend the time integrating, and something
Mhm.
that they feel like they can work some of their magic on too and still have some upside as it relates to revenue and profitability in it.
Yeah, yeah. And so as we transition to this slide that you have this target acquisition profile, tell us about this. Like walk us through this for a potential buyer.
Yeah, this expounds upon what I said in conclusion of the other slide, which is be a slow yes and a fast no. So what we're looking for when we think about the practices we might want to acquire, we want to figure out things that do not work for us, that are outside of our strike zone. If we use that fee for service to Medicaid piece, that's an obvious one, but it
Hmm.
illustrates the point. The second one might be something akin to the capacity of the practice. If I buy a practice that has 4 or 5 operatories and I'm a general dentist, that immediately creates provider risk. Because if something happens to that provider, I have to fire them, they have a health scare, they're out, or they resign abruptly, that's probably going to be dark revenue days. So maybe on our target acquisition profile, we're not going to buy anything that has 6 or fewer operatories. We're only going to look for 6 or more, just to use an example. It could be something geographic in terms of proximity, intentionally cannibalizing some of the patients out of our core practice to
Hmm.
alleviate capacity constraints in that business. Could be payer mix. Again, the team tenure and turnover, like I mentioned before, is something worthy of consideration. And then the other piece, Ali, is the procedure mix itself. So, take two sides of the same coin. If I'm buying your practice and you have an expanded clinical skill set, you can do all on X cases and guided implant surgery and single visit, in office CAD CAM based restorations and clear aligners and all this great stuff that adds to the revenue line of your business. And I can't do any of that. I'm buying your practice, but if you get struck by lightning tomorrow, where does most of the goodwill go? Up in
Right,
smoke. So that
right.
shifts the risk onto me. The reverse of that is if you don't do any of those procedures and you're referring all of them out, but I have the capability with me and my associates to do all of that. Now there's a phenomenal amount of upside that I'm looking at. And it's important to be able to identify and even quantify a lot of these opportunities. The last thing I'll say at the bottom point there, the key point is that your integration team, and you should definitely have one if you're in the acquisition game, will lead your change efforts for sure. Be diplomatic and methodical about how quickly you enforce all of that, because it will probably create angst on the people in the practice that's being acquired. So be just mindful of cultural integration issues and always reinforce your communication with them.
Yeah, I love this list. I love this list, and I love this task of doing this. We've had a lot of clients who um, haven't done that, to your point, and have just acquired practices. And I have one in mind that grew from one to basically 10 in a 36-month period, where he was just acquiring, but they were really not good fits with what his overall strategy was, which was a really good strategy. And he had a total body health kind of plan and all of that. And he had a lot of sellers who sold and promised to work back, who then bailed on him. And I mean, there's just a lot, but that would have been a really incredible exercise to go through for sure.
Yep. Yep. Without a doubt.
Yeah. So now, as we transition, we always hear this kind of statement where, you say, people are, coaches and consultants say, we want to work on the practice, not necessarily in the practice, right? And that, of course, has some serious impact on cash flow when you're an operator versus a producer and whatnot. So can you go through that with us?
Yeah, Michael Gerber's made a killing out of that phrase from his book, The E-Myth, right? Working in it
Right.
is working on it. So
Yeah.
yeah, let's
Yeah.
go through a little bit of math on this next slide, I think, coming up. So first question before we even start down the process is, and when people ask, hey, Perrin, I'm thinking about acquiring another practice, what should I do? This will be my first acquisition. My first question to them is, yeah, how much cash are you sitting on the sidelines? And is your family lifestyle one dependent upon you withdrawing 100% of the available income out of your core practice? Although
Mhm.
you and I like the finer things in life, many of the people on this webinar do as well. No judgment on that. None of us do what we do for free. That being said, when you start acquiring practices, you are going to have to make investments in that business as well as your own. And if you don't have cash on the sidelines availability to do that, you will immediately get into conflict with your family around a lifestyle. And that's a terrible position to be in. The other
Yeah.
thing, to state the obvious, is that absentee owners typically create failures. So don't go off and buy a practice if you don't think you can devote the time to working in it yourself, or even splitting time between your core practice and your first acquisition. The dirty secret, in my experience, is that every founder of a group practice takes an income hit in the early stages of the business. The questions are how much of a hit and for how long. And I'll illustrate that on the next slide, I think, here.
Yeah, and I think that family portion, Perrin, is really often overlooked. People sometimes ask me, it's like, Ali, how do you have the law firm and how do you have, HR for health, and how do you split your time? How do you do both and this thing and that thing? And I go, I don't always say it depending on the audience, but I'm always thinking it's because I've got an incredible spouse who, allows me the flexibility to do this stuff because it's like you said, if you don't have family support, and she's a pediatric dentist, as you know, and she's busy in her own practice and does her own thing. But my point is if you don't have that support at home, it's game over. And to your point, if you don't have that free cash flow and it starts impacting the family, suddenly, it's a much more costly acquisition than you ever imagined.
Yeah, that's some challenging pillow talk to be sure, right?
Yeah,
So,
yeah,
so let's take a quick math example. I'm going to try to spin through this quickly for the audience, but hopefully not confuse anybody. So the column in the middle there that says our practice, it's a plain vanilla garden variety $1 million revenue general dentistry practice. And this is just a Mickey Mouse example to illustrate the point. Split between clinical and hygiene 80-20, running about a 60% overhead rate. Operating profits around 400 grand. We pay some taxes. Let's say we have no debt on the business. Our free cash flow take home income ultimately is around 300 grand. Pretty simple. When we look at our practice, though, and we start thinking, okay, I want to acquire other practices, and the likelihood is I'm going to have to start spending time in those practices, or I'm going to have to spend time looking for practices or recruiting associates. I'm going to have to spend time doing something other than clinical services. Well, the clinical work doesn't go away. We got to pay somebody to do the work that we're no longer doing. And if I'm working 4 days a week in that practice, maybe I'm going to cut down ultimately to two, but I'm going to pay an associate to work the other 2 days a week. And if the compensation rate I use is 30% of his or her clinical collections, that means I'm going to spend about 100, I'm going to make an investment of about $120,000 in an associate to do the work that I'm no longer doing. Now,
hmm
this lowers our entrepreneurial profit or operating profit, and we can see we pay less in taxes, but it has a pretty dramatic effect on our free cash flow. So if we transition to the next slide, I'll show you what this starts to mean as it relates to acquiring your next practice or your first practice. So what we're going to do here in the middle is once again our practice that we just showed with the associate working half the time and me working the other half the time. That's the example I just went through.
yeah,
So on the right hand side, we're going to acquire a practice that looks the exact same. It generates $1 million in revenue. It values at about 80% of revenue or 800 grand, split 80/20 clinical to hygiene, running a 60% overhead rate. And when we pay an associate to work in that practice, we pay him or her 30% of their collections. This leaves an entrepreneurial profit for us as the owner now of about $160,000. We pay some taxes, got to pay the bank on a 10-year note at a 6% rate, roughly about $108,000. Leaves free cash flow of about 12 grand on the bottom. Not a lot, right? We started out with $1
That's
million.
barely a vacation these days. Yeah.
Yeah. So people think when they buy a practice that it's going to be a wash in cash. And it's not unless you are working in it full time. And only then possibly so. So when we think about walking away from clinical income in our core practice, there's a cost to that, an investment to it. When we think about acquiring another practice, the first thing is we have to consider who's going to be the productive capacity in that business, us full-time, an associate part-time, the seller for some extended period of time. We got to pay somebody to do the clinical work. But the likelihood is after we pay taxes and after we pay the bank, there's not a whole lot of there, right?
Exactly.
So this is a representation of the first step that starts to happen along those lines. So, is the practice you're about to acquire in the black or the red from a free cash flow perspective after taxes and after debt service? And how much of a downturn might have to happen before you win in the red? And from this example, I think we can probably both agree that if this thing takes a slight dip in revenue, we're all of a sudden in the red on the bottom line as it relates to our bank account, worse than we already are.
Yeah, and what I want to highlight for the audience, just so that everyone's on the same page, the column on the left assumes that you as the owner are working 50% of the time and the associate is working the other 50%. That's why when it says doctor's comp or associate comp there, it's at 120,000. But the reality is that, remember, if you're working 2-3 days a week, let's say, and then you're trying to manage the other practice, you're working, like most entrepreneurs, you're working, 6-7 days a week. And so there's not a lot of, like you said, profit there potentially. And if you cut back even more, then your current practice could fall even further.
That's
So
that's right. I would always get the question in working with people in a consulting relationship, and they say, "Hey, Perrin, why is it that now that I own 4 practices, I'm making half as much income as when I had 1 practice?" And I'm like,
right.
"Well, you want me to show you the math? Here's the start to it, and this is the start of the reason why."
Yeah. Well, it's funny I love the way you broke this down. We have a seminar that we give to doctors who want to bring their first associates, Perrin, and there's one part of the analysis that I go through where it talk about how much should you pay your associate, right? And we go through the analysis and whatnot. It's somewhat similar to this. And what's interesting is we get the most questions about it because no one's ever thought about it. And what's always sort of fascinating to me is that CPAs and other consultants aren't willing to have these conversations, with their doctors. And this is such an integral part of the transition. It's not just about buying them. So you got
Yeah,
to do the number crunching. Yeah, this is
exactly
awesome.
right. Exactly right. Take a look at the next slide real quick, or okay. So
Yeah,
yeah, I think this one comes up on your wheelhouse here.
it does. Yeah. Did you have anything else? It sounded
No,
like you
no.
had something else you wanted to
I,
mention. Go,
I
feel
think
free.
it.
We're not in a rush.
I think it comes up in the next section that I'm in. I said
Okay.
that I rehearsed my slides, but I might have been lying a little bit to you. But
Okay.
we're all good, right?
All right, no worries. All right, so let's talk a little bit about so you've done your acquisition analysis, you've decided that this is the one you want to buy. You've talked to Perrin, you've done all the work, now you've gone through the acquisition. Now we're talking about what happens post acquisition. And the first 90 days after a practice acquisition is what I call the make or break window. Why? Well, because it's during this time that the team is trying to answer a very fundamental question, which is, can I trust this new leadership? Right? This is why, right, when we talk to sellers, we say, don't tell your team that you're selling your practice until you have until all documents are signed and whatnot. Then you can have a team meeting and do that whole thing, because there's an immediate distrust with new leadership. And when we talk about onboarding, it's not just about paperwork and passwords, it's about setting the tone, expectations, and then the direction for the company. And if you don't proactively onboard your new team, you're asking them to figure it out on their own, which of course leads to missteps, rumors, resistance, and all this other stuff that you just don't need when you're buying a practice, right? So from a business standpoint, you know, poor integration hurts productivity, it hurts the patient experience, and definitely hurts, the retention of those patients. Some offices say, I don't know why so many patients left. They must have loved the seller. It's like, yeah, but could they maybe have been confused by what the team is telling them? Right? I had heard a consultant years ago, parents say, he was asking the audience, who's the most trusted person in a dental practice? And of course, it was a room full of doctors, and none of them said the doctors, right? Because they knew, right? And the answer was the hygienist, of course. And so imagine the practice is just sold, you're the buyer, you haven't done all this onboarding, and the patient says, hey, so I hear that there's a new doctor in town. And then the hygienist says something like, yeah, they're okay, right? I mean, that's all you need, right?
Yeah.
Turnover spikes, morale dips, and then all these ROIs that you're hoping for just doesn't happen. And based on the data that we just saw from Perrin, you have $12,000 of wiggle room. That's not very much. That's like half of a full mouth case,
That's right. That's right.
So,
You're
so,
burning funds quickly.
yeah, exactly. So that's why if you don't get it right in those first 90 days, everything that follows, performance, loyalty, growth, um, you know, uh, you know, becomes a lot easier. Um, but you got to do it right. You got to do it right, and that's huge. That's a huge point. The second part is, it's about clarity, which is, uh, when there's frustration, there's a lack of clarity involved, and so you'd be surprised, I think, to hear how many times employees, after an acquisition, don't know who to report to, don't know, what kind of instructions to listen to. They maybe did something differently with the elder doctor. Now they're with you, and they don't know what to do there. They may not, jive in terms of leadership style. So all this ambiguity really creates confusion. It creates double work, power struggles. And so I think creating communicating clear structures is important. And that's where your employment manual that we at HR for Health would prepare for you really kind of takes care of that, because it makes sure that there's not that uncertainty that feels threatening, especially during a transition, right? Especially during a transition. So the more clear you are, the more clarity there is that you provide, the more confident the team will be. They may not agree with you, 100%. My wife always says, I hear you, you're very clear, but I still don't disagree with you. you know, so it doesn't matter how clear I am. I don't think she'll ever agree with me. so,
That's
so,
that's
so
that's
anyway,
that's one acquisition you shouldn't pursue, right? It needs to be a merger, not an acquisition.
yeah, and definitely do not divest. It'll be your worst mistake.
Very well said.
So okay, so then finally for me is, one question we get a lot, and Perrin, I'd love your input on this too, which is, um, what are some friction points that we see? And I would say there's maybe three friction points that I see. And Perrin, if there's any that you think of, please, let us know, of course. One is cultural clash. Okay, so making sure that, if you've acquired it, that the vibe is going to be different, almost certain. It might be more casual, it might be more formal, it might be more independent, it might be hierarchical. I mean, it might be anything. But making sure that you're addressing the culture, making sure that another friction point is the documentation gaps, right? The seller may not have had good documentation, so it's time for you to be consistent about that and how you communicate that to people. I think is important. Sometimes they might think that more information is scary to them because they might say, oh my gosh, they're putting so many restrictions on us. But it's like, no, 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 we're giving you more. We're just telling you about it. You don't have to guess. And then I think accountability, right? Making sure that there's no vacuum there in terms of accountability. I'm a very, straightforward kind of shooter when it comes to this. I think everyone works hard, but you got to hold people accountable to things. And I think it's important to have systems in place that do that, or have leadership structures that do that as well. So, any other friction points, Perrin, that you can think of that are predictable and preventable?
Yeah, you hit the last one right there was the first one I was going to say, expectations and accountability. It goes without saying that if you're acquiring practices, you're of a business mindset and you're driven for results. That does not mean that the seller, especially if he or she had a legacy team around them, has ever really held them to some level of accountability for the
Yeah,
results that they've delivered. So that's probably going to be a little bit of a culture shock, and you need to be diplomatic about it if your intent is to keep them on board. The second thing I would say, more from an operational standpoint, is a change in software. People get
yep,
set in their ways, and inevitably, when I hear that people want to change software in the first week, they're the people that are being acquired are already anxious enough about the transition. The likelihood is that you can achieve through a dashboard type of a setup enough of a software integration, at least in the short run, to not necessitate that on day one like you would a bank or a payroll type system. So
yep.
maybe let's leave software for a little bit further down the road.
Dude, I love that, parent. I love that idea because it is such a scary thing for so many employees to switch that. And one of the mistakes I see frequently is where people change softwares and then they've got maybe an older team, that they've just acquired, and people get nervous about it, and then they're like, oh man, this person's lazy, or this person is this or that, and they fire them, and then they get sued for like age discrimination. They're like, oh, so yeah, I'm totally with you on there. Okay, so I know, let's go through your stuff here. I
Yep.
know you said you had some points that you wanted to finish from before, so let's go through that.
Yeah, I think when another sort of fundamental flaw in most people's approach to acquiring practices is that they really don't spend, if they don't spend the time to identify the pitches they shouldn't swing at, they're also not spending the
Mm,
time to quantify the impact that they're going to make on that practice. So the philosophy is, and I share this quote a lot, you never buy a practice to maintain it. You
mhm,
only buy a practice if you're confident that you can improve it, and you should always quantify what those improvements are going to be a year or 2 years down the road. We want this to be a better business after we get our hands on it than what the seller's been able to produce up to this point. And I'll give you I'll walk you through this example in the next slide. I think well, again, there'll be some more math here, but I think it'll, or to illustrate the point, we're looking at it two ways. We want to generate revenue, and we want to reduce to a degree expenses. So
mhm,
revenue generation could be preferential insurance reimbursement rates. It could be that we're going to expand some days and hours to take better advantage of the fixed constraints of the business. Could be expanded clinical or more complicated clinical treatment itself.
mhm.
Um, Gaining, scheduling efficiencies and increasing case acceptance rates, adding an associate into it, spending money for new marketing plans for new patients. And obviously, if it's specialty business, improving referral sources. And then obviously spending some time in terms of a clinical skill development program for the people that we have in
Yeah,
that business. On the expense side, I hate to lead with this one, but wages are your biggest line item. And if you have somebody that retires or quits or leaves or whatever, Is it necessary truly to replace them, or might you be able to reallocate their duties to other people and save on some headcount? Reducing office supplies and clinical supplies, professional services, maybe gaining some buying spend on marketing and reducing your unit costs with that. Um, uh, Ironing out operational inefficiencies, automating HR and payroll and benefits and all the component that come with the HR for health type of a suite. There's a lot more than just this, but we need to be thinking in terms of these, and in terms of what are some of the things we're going to do to generate revenue, and what are some of the things we're going to do to curtail expenses. And if we are able to achieve that, what is the impact of those improvements a year or 2 years down the road?
Yeah, exactly. And sometimes, for the audience, it's not about necessarily dismissing employees. I don't think parents saying about
No.
that. I think, it's sometimes you got the right person, wrong job for them, right? Where you can automate things and then use that person to, help you generate more revenue by maybe calling, patients, on, doing other things inside the practice that are more revenue generation, items, because now you've automated things on the back end. And that, I think that analysis is such an important analysis for every practice. I mean, not just ones that are being bought and sold, but just everybody should go through that.
Yep,
So
exactly right. Take a
yeah.
look at the next slide and maybe quantify some of the impact on it. So this is
Oh,
a
nice.
busy slide. I realize I'll try to narrate it. It's a little bit Mickey Mouse, but I think you'll get the idea here. So here on the left hand side, the first column here is that $1 million practice that we acquired a couple of slides ago, right? 80/20 clinical to hygiene, everything that I said before. When we quantify what we're going to do after we acquire the business, we may, put an associate in and expand some days and hours. We have some type of a revenue generation impact. And if we forecast that to be about 10% on the top line, which is showing in the second column there, you can see how it starts to translate through the operating statement in and of itself. And you can see how a lot of that drops to the bottom line in terms of entrepreneurial profit. Our debt service stays the same. It does not increase with any increase in revenue. So now we're starting to make an impact on free cash flow. And the bottom box at the very bottom says equity on balance sheet. If we're building a
Mhm.
group practice, whether we intend to sell it to an enterprise buyer or private equity group, or whether we intend to allow associates to buy in and earn into the business and become a partner in it, we want to create an increasingly valuable business over time, not just from a free cash flow standpoint, but from an actual valuation standpoint. The third column is growing revenue while reducing some of the overhead in the business. And you can see that the impact that makes on a free cash flow standpoint, and certainly equity on balance sheet at the very bottom. And the final column indicates that through all of our process improvements of revenue generation and cost containment, if this becomes part of a larger group and a higher EBITDA volume, then the likelihood is that it values more highly from a valuation multiple standpoint. And this is where we really start, I like to say, cooking with gas in terms of the equity position of the business that we're building. And it's
Mhm.
really nice if you're allowing associates or people to buy into the business, that you as the founder don't end up prematurely selling a stake in the business or selling it at a suppressed value. And this is something that can allow you to bring in minority partners along the way. So hopefully this example is a little bit illustrative of revenue generation, expense management, and value creation in the business.
No, that is fantastic. That is such a great way of seeing how the impact of just a little bit of growth, and a little bit of cost cutting together, what an impact it can have on the valuation. Because to your point, when the debt service is the same, a lot of this goes directly to the bottom line, which can definitely impact the value that someone's willing to pay for it. So
That's exactly right.
yeah.
Exactly right.
Yeah, and we've seen examples of this as well, where someone just from a compliance perspective, if they're not compliant, it impacts the numbers the other way, where it'll drop 1 to 2 points simply because there's additional risk associated with the practice. So.
That's right. That's
So.
right.
So, all right. Well, as we end, I know we're a little bit over time. I want to talk just a couple of points about the tools for success. Now, we've talked about a lot of the things, but now how do you make sure you've got the tools in place? I think the tool number one, or at least a solution, is to digitally have onboarding workflows. Systems like HR for Health, can help you kind of systemize your onboarding checklist for new and transitioning employees. No detail would be missed. All the tax forms are filed. That also helps you with HR compliance tracking, which would be, I think, the second solution. So you've got some automation for workflows and onboarding when you're buying, but then you've got your compliance tools as well to make sure that you're legal kind of moving forward. And of course, I think tool number three, to make sure everything's safe, nothing gets lost, is having a centralized document storage in one place, where of course HR for Health can provide that as part of their service, and so that everything is there in one place. And that's one thing that I see sometimes happen, where employees, when they find out there's a transition or they're unhappy, suddenly files start to disappear. Right? Files start to disappear, and that's never a good thing. Never a good thing. But Perrin, I'd love for you to kind of talk to the audience about your services at Next Level, and more importantly, maybe expand on this one idea. Maybe this is our last kind of concept or idea to talk about, which is growth is only scalable, right, if your team structure is as well.
Yeah, and maybe we can flip to the slide that has a little bit of my contact information there, because I think there'll be,
Yeah.
I think that might be the next one. There we go. I knew it was coming up eventually. I love me some me, Ali.
Yeah, that's a nice picture. Yeah,
yeah,
that's a great picture. Yeah,
you know,
more Perrin, the better. Yeah.
hopefully everybody's looking at this on a big screen. So, you know, I think, look, I think you're right. I mean, I think from, a business building standpoint, when you make that transition from being a clinician who owns a practice into an entrepreneur who owns a business, you have to create results through other people, right? You have to be an effective executive. And now this is a business that is no longer dependent upon you and you alone, your clinical skill set. And that has a lot of advantages, but it also has a lot of jeopardy to it. And most dentists haven't worked in an environment where they've really, beyond the four walls and the roof above them with a small team, they haven't really had to truly create results through people that aren't sitting next to them or aren't in the same environment with them. So it's really a pretty substantial transition when you start talking about adding additional locations and making practice acquisitions. We've covered a lot of ground here today, but there's obviously a lot more to it. And I think it places an emphasis on that person's ability to invest in themselves from a professional development standpoint, leadership development standpoint, every bit as much as they did formerly from a clinical skill development standpoint.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's well said. Yeah, and I'll end on this, guys. I think you can acquire multiple practices. I think you can expand locations, you can expand services, but if your HR systems, your team roles, your leadership structure don't scale with you, growth will slow down or even backfire, as Perrin has, summarized today. That's why integration isn't just an HR thing. It's really a growth strategy, and a necessity. So if you're committed to scaling smart, make sure you invest in the systems, you have clarity and communication, and those will support the people that you are acquiring to help you grow. And Perrin's available. This is all his contact info. Please reach out to him as you are going down this road. Obviously, we wanted to give you a sense of all the components of growth from an HR and people and leadership perspective. But there's, as he said, there's a lot more there that needs to be done. So reach out to him, and if anybody wants, to have HR for Health do an audit of your systems to see how you're doing from an HR, perspective, reach out to our team, and we'll be happy to do an audit for you and give you some strategies for compliance. All right, Perrin, thank you so much for being here, and can't wait to see you soon.
Looking forward to the next time, Ali. Thank you very much.
Take care. Have a great day, everyone. Bye bye.
Cheers.